think generally people know that there is a churn and activation problem in their businesses, and they might not know that onboarding is the solution. But if you can come in and convince and convey some of that, you get a better chance of proving that value out.
Welcome to Onboarding Therapy. I'm Kim, and in this episode, Sherelle and I are talking about how to get company leaders to support customer onboarding. We discuss ways to show onboarding's value and connect it to business goals. Let's get into it.
Last time we talked about onboarding and sales alignment, sales handoffs, how onboarding and sales work together. And we ended with the realization and acknowledgement that all of the initiatives that we were talking about just can't happen at a company where leadership is not bought into onboarding and doesn't understand the value of onboarding. And they're not going to let you work with the sales team in the way that we were mentioning if that's not the case.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think historically, and this is a blanket statement, but I do feel like historically success or like post-sales motions have been viewed almost as a secondary or a reactive motion to, we've done the marketing, we've done the sales. That's usually high energy, high buzz, high dollar spend because of CAC and how much it actually costs to acquire a customer. And I think customers feel that. And there's lots of momentum and excitement, and customers ask all the time in sales, what's next? How do we get started? And then where there isn't often buy-in or investing in that space, and to be fair, sometimes it's even understanding. It's not that some sales leader is just like against it or executive leaders against the concept of onboarding. There might just be a lack of understanding of its value or how it ties to revenue. Because again, it's historically, I think, generally not viewed as a revenue driving function and more of almost like a cost center. So when that is the case, it is easy to feel that you're not going to get budget, you're not going to get new tools, you're not going to get the support you need, which then does make it hard to onboard customers. Whenever there is that resistance to this is a post-sales motion or it's a reactive motion or even gets bucketed sometimes into like support category, if you can convince or convey that there is a revenue component here, and because we are onboarding these customers a little bit faster or more effectively or meeting them where they need to be met and making that handoff smoother, can you start to prove that motion is the reason customers are sticking around longer and not churning? And again, none of that guarantees all of a sudden they're going to stick around forever and start renewing their contracts and expanding their usage, but it at least gives you the chance. Whereas if they cancel on day 30, like that's it. You have spent that money, and yeah, you might have some clawbacks in your process for sales. But generally speaking, you have spent the money, you've spent the time, you've spent the energy, and now you've lost that customer. And so whenever I hear we have a churn problem at day 30, we have a churn problem at day 60 of the life cycle, even day 90, like that usually indicates there is some sort of implementation or onboarding or activation problem. Going a little further, there might be a sales to success handoff problem. But generally speaking, those first moments of the life cycle, that perception of whatever the customer signed up for isn't being met, and now they are canceling, which is tiring, it's exhausting, is obviously expensive, it's demotivating both to sales and success teams. And so whenever I've worked at those types of places, and I have, where onboarding is viewed as more of an afterthought or kind of, we'll figure it out, sales will do it or success will do it, or customers will figure it out themselves because their design is so amazingly intuitive, and turns out it's not, and customers aren't activating right. So I'm always of the mindset of how can I convey that there is revenue here? So even when we use things like pipelines inside of HubSpot to manage onboarding, whether it's a deal pipeline where the amount already exists on that record, or on tickets, I pull over the amount from the deal so that in my pipeline, I can say there is $2 million of revenue sitting in this ready for onboarding stage. And if we don't activate them, and it might not be directly what I'm about to say, but you can almost start to forecast that is lost revenue or churn risk, at least, if we don't do something. So whenever you start to pull money into it, and you still might run into some resistance around certain leaders not viewing it as a monetary motion, which is okay. But if you can at least convince some people that there is money here, and because they are churning, we are losing that money, there is some sort of value here to keep these customers alive, for lack of a better term, or sticking around. And that's how I've been able to convince some folks to lean in a little bit more, and obviously doing the work and proving you actually are saving these customers by that motion. So two things I try to do there is, one, did they churn? If no, great, we're doing something better here. And then are they expanding? So are they growing? Are they adding seats? Are they adding features? Are they using other verticals of your product that they might not have been before? And where I've been able to prove that to my leaders, I've noticed more often than not, I've been able to get buy-in and support and slowly with time, get more and more budget essentially for things like hiring either more team members or getting the right tooling. And then the truth is, I've also been at places where I've done all that and we've proven it's working or starting to work and still haven't gotten all of the buy-in I've needed or the support I've needed. And in your role, you still have to keep chipping away at that, obviously, and trying to make progress and conveying the value there. But it just becomes a little bit harder if you don't have that support. So very high level, try to make it somehow related back to business metrics. Every business is trying to make money. Like that's what we're all doing. So is there a correlation to that? And it might not be the most like direct correlation, or it might not register that way to certain leaders. But the more you can keep pushing on that idea that there is money here, we did spend money to get these customers here. If we're so concerned about their lifetime value and keeping them around longer, if they churn on day zero, that's zero lifetime value. So like, how do we expand and extend that? So where possible, tie it back to revenue, try to tell that story over and over again. Find champions, even in different departments, that can also see that. Like if you work with one sales rep who gets the handoff with you, who understands his customers or her customers are doing better as they continue to hand them off to onboarding and keep them going down the journey. If you can tell that like joint story from a few departments, that might further increase your chances of getting some of that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think several things come to mind. One, I don't think we can expect that most leaders will inherently understand the value of onboarding. I think everyone needs to go in expecting that they're going to have to prove the value. And I think that's fine for right now. Sales and marketing have been around forever. Everyone knows the metrics that sales and marketing needs to be held to and the impact that those teams have on the business. Onboarding is still new. There's still so much to learn. And I think it's going to be a long time before you are reliably going to find leadership that is really bought into customer onboarding specifically. And I think it's because when you are looking at numbers as a leader for the company, you're thinking of new revenue and you're thinking of churn. Those are like the two kind of major levers that you're forecasting and predicting for the health of your business. So where does onboarding fit into that? Yes, if there is early churn, that's a piece that can be measured and that's fine within onboarding. But I do think it is on the onboarding team or the onboarding team's leader to figure out how they're impacting the business, because it's probably in much bigger ways than just preventing early churn. You have to empower yourself to understand and make sure that you're actually adding value in a way that isn't just preventing early churn and is actually contributing to the entire post-sale customer lifecycle. And I think that's just a thing that you have to understand. What are the metrics that leadership cares about? What is the actual customer journey before and after onboarding? And then where does onboarding fit in and what is the maximum impact that you can have? And then onboarding has to be responsible for creating those metrics. I think that's the thing that we see a lot is that nobody's ever tracked anything in onboarding. Nobody has any idea how long it takes their customers to get up and running. Nobody has any idea how many of their customers are failing or succeeding in onboarding. And it's just like Wild West. You have to be responsible for tracking and owning your metrics, and then also conveying your wins and what's happening to your leadership, because they're just never going to be bought in. It makes sense that they wouldn't be if they're not made aware of that, and they're not proactively going to do it as much as we wish they would.
Yeah, 100%. And the other, to sprinkle in some more challenge in there, I fully agree. That needs to be owned in onboarding. You have to, in onboarding or CS or whoever's owning that function in your organization. And not only do you have to do everything you just shared about owning it and reporting on it and sharing it and sharing it and sharing it like as much as you can, the other challenge is the results are actually lagging indicators. Like they won't show up potentially until a year down the road, 2 years down. Depending on contract terms, it might be 3 years before you see the result of good onboarding. Because if someone's signing a 3-year contract and they're bound to stick around for 3 years, there's no good way to say they stuck around because of onboarding or not. So it isn't as direct as we want it to be. And I think you and I are the type of people that want it to be very obvious and screaming that it's working. And the reality is that's just not true. It takes a long time to prove its value. If you're changing things in onboarding and hoping the goal is to reduce churn, you're probably not going to see that until the year mark of customers or growth. Sorry. Churn, you might be able to report on a little sooner because if you had 70% of your customers churning before you had an onboarding program and now you install one, you can at least quickly say, all right, now it's 60% churn. And we can attest some of that to this. But if you're trying to combat things like expansion and renewing annual contracts or preventing long-term churn and activation, like you're not going to see those results till a year, 18 months, maybe even beyond that in. So on top of everything you said, I think you also have to be very diligent and consistent with the reporting. Mm-hmm. And I've done this myself, a lot of that, I remember at one of my previous jobs, I still have this somewhere, me and the manager of the onboarding team had a piece of paper where we were literally tallying how many customers did we onboard this month, how many of them churned, and how many didn't. It was that physical piece of paper. And that's because we didn't have the buy-in or the budget to go buy the proper tool to manage it and track it and any of that. And obviously that's an extreme example, but then I've kept so many spreadsheets of what is it not, how can I prove any sort of value internally? And it's a struggle until it's not. And once you can prove that value, so when I have been able to actually prove it, then it's all right, I get to speak at every business QBR and I have the attention of all the directors of the company because it's so impactful on their actual bottom line and bigger business metrics that we're after. So I would actually be careful of claiming it's going to do its thing really well and actually try to find other departments and other goals that are already there and that are business metrics that you're thinking about and thinking through and figure out how do we support these things? How can we go back and say we started working with SMB customers specifically in Q2 of this year and 6 months down the road, here's our hypothesis. And let's figure out, can we track that over time and just be consistent with it? It's things like, to pull in tools like Arrows as an example, it's being able to identify, all right, these customers did go through onboarding and they were X level of engaged based on how much activity we saw or task we saw done, and then drawing correlations and saying things like, we think if a customer completes their plan in X time, they are more likely to be successful. And then a year down the road, asking yourself, was that true or not? Because to your point too, there's so much qualitative feedback in onboarding. And I do this myself all the time. I'll get off a call and be like, that person was super excited. They're going to be around forever and they're going to be the best customer in the world. And then 2 months later, they're churning because they didn't activate them. And then you'll get feedback that, yeah, you guys were great and your product is great and your staff is all incredibly friendly and our goals weren't met with your product. So you have to be consistent. You have to report on the data. Sometimes the data doesn't even exist, or you don't even know what it is you're writing a report on. There's no tool for it to be measured. Get your hands dirty, get out the spreadsheets, get out the old paper and start to tally stuff off. One thing I will say that I have seen in my own experience is 10 years ago, I was never actively recruited, nor did roles exist for this type of thing. I never saw a manager of onboard senior level type roles. And now at least I see some of that out in the market. It's far and few still, to your point, it's still some time, I think, to actually make this a more well-known motion across everything. But I think generally people know that there is a churn and activation problem in their businesses, and they might not know that onboarding is the solution. But if you can come in and convince and convey some of that, you get a better chance of proving that value out. And I think that's happening in small pockets at places because I'm starting to see roles like director of onboarding. I've even seen VP of onboarding roles or head of onboarding roles at bigger companies. So it at least tells me there is some desire to fix this problem and start to address it and focus on it. I'd love to see that everywhere, but obviously it takes time. Just like CS itself, customer success was a buzzword 10, 15 years ago. And now everyone understands it, or most people understand it as a motion that can keep customers around and keep them retained. So I think onboarding is hopefully on that track.
Yeah, I was going to mention too, I did the same thing you did. I didn't write my things down by hand for onboarding, but I had a spreadsheet when I first started onboarding. I had a spreadsheet and there were no formulas. This was a completely manual spreadsheet where I wrote down every single new customer. We weren't backfilling the data from anywhere else. I manually put in every single new customer, how much they were paying us, how long it took them to get through an onboarding. And then I also had 6 or 7 other business metrics that I knew the company cared about. And I was like, I think that onboarding is going to impact these, but I don't know. And so I would manually put those in for every single new customer we got. And we were doing high volumes. This was not an easy task, but I would put that in and then I would look at it every few weeks and start to draw correlations. What I noticed is, if someone onboards in 5 or 7 days, they are across the board more successful 3 months in, 6 months in, whatever it is. But like, it's hard to measure that. And I wouldn't recommend setting up systems to measure that right away. You have to do it manually and figure it out and say, I'm noticing this across a bunch of customers, the ones that are taking 10 times longer than the rest of the customers are never activating. That's not someone that we need to spend our time on. It's not someone we need to be chasing down. They're never going to be a successful customer if they're not eager to actually get in and start onboarding. So I do think it's okay to do things manually and figure out the value of onboarding manually for quite some time. And I think it's really similar to like marketing, for example, where you're betting on something. Like, I bet that if I make this change to this process, this is going to be the outcome. And you don't find out until 3 months later, whenever it is. It's not going to be a short-term win. Oftentimes you might see small kind of things, but to really prove that, it is going to be a longer term kind of project that you have to figure out.
Yeah, totally. One, I was going to call it a hack. I don't know if it's a hack, but one way to prove value a little bit faster that I've done in the past is when your product teams, if you're in some sort of tech space, when your product teams are launching a new feature, taking that specific feature and incorporating a little talk track about it in onboarding calls, because then you could actually go back and say, it's especially when you have a large app, right? When there's multiple features, multiple verticals, multiple things you can do in there. We all know that not every customer needs every single thing activated in that first moment, and it's all about ongoing activation and all that. But whenever there's a new feature launching, that can be a quick way to say, all right, we're going to incorporate this into our talk track, and we might not do it to this depth for every single feature, but to prove that onboarding is impacting activation, you can say, for the next 100 customers, we are going to proactively talk about this specific feature, and then let's measure over the next 3 months usage of that feature. And odds are, because it's new and flashy and you're talking about it with customers, you can at least prove that the act of describing something or talking about something or educating on something in onboarding, this could also, mind you, could be one-to-one or in-app or webinar. Like, you can build a strategy around that specific thing in any of those fashions and then measure that and then go back and say, all right, again, here's a small hypothesis. We talked about this feature. All of a sudden, 90% of customers are activating it and using it. How do we do more of this for our less used features? Or better yet, for those features that we know are value adds and specific to customers' goals? Like, how do you focus on that piece of it? So you can get small samples of data in that way. But I love what you said about, and I agree, don't even try to start with the complex reports or complex automations of reporting of that kind of nature, because half the time you don't even know what it is you're looking for or measuring. And then I love the second thing you said, start manually there, but I love the second thing you said too about finding potentially some other metrics that you can also impact. Maybe more generic things that aren't necessarily onboarding related. Things like even CSAT 6 months down the road. Are customers who talk to your team in onboarding more satisfied than not? And no one's, especially at the senior level, no one's going to care about the nitty gritty of the details. We're looking for patterns and trends of, yes, now they are 40% more likely to be satisfied, or they are 40% more likely to activate this feature and use it. And enough of those little moments can do two things: start to prove some value, but also hopefully give you some confidence that you're actually heading down the right direction. Because it can get, I've hit my head against the wall so many times on trying to run reports and trying to prove thoughts that I thought were true, and then either not having the data or not knowing how to present it or not knowing how to tell that story, or doing all of that stuff in front of my C-suite and then it not being correlated to the actual quarterly goals or business metrics that we're after. So it is a lot of trial and error. It is a lot of, candidly, it's a lot of guessing at times and betting on yourself, like you said, or betting on the thing and saying, this is what I think is going to happen. I have enough confidence to try it. And I might not even try it with, and that's the other thing, you don't have to try it with every single onboarding CSM on your team or every single customer. Like, really start small. Pick one thing, pick 10 customers, start to find some patterns in there. Because I do think it will take a long time to actually prove business value, but you can prove small values to yourself and small truths to yourself early on, which can build more momentum for you to keep going and start to get at least some buy-in from some people around you.
Yeah, I was going to say too, if anyone is in a company where you don't realize revenue until your customer is activated, then you should have leadership buy-in.
Yeah.
immediately. I've been trying to think of like, why did I have buy-in from my leadership team? And I think part of it was that I had spent most of my career in sales. So I knew the metrics that revenue leaders cared about, and I was like used to communicating them. I was used to communicating my goals and how I was hitting them and how that was going. I think a lot of onboarding and CS people are helpers, and they're people who are like want to support other people, and they're not so good at speaking up for themselves. So that's one kind of piece of it. The other piece of, I think, why I had buy-in is that we were a SaaS and marketplace product, monthly revenue from our customers, but we really made money when they had success on our marketplace. And so it was really advantageous for the company to get them up and running quickly and to get their marketplace listings done really so that people would actually purchase on the marketplace. So I think that's like a piece of it too, where if they're, and I think probably half of our customers have a business model like that. If you're a POS system or something like that, where you're actually making the most of your money once your customer is truly activated.
Yeah.
It's not just a recurring monthly subscription. And I think that is a point where you should have access to a ton of metrics, and you should be looking at how much money they're bringing in their first 14 days, first 30 days, and you should be trying to get that number as big as you can, as quickly as you can. And I think that's actually a really easy way to start tracking and like really showing the value of onboarding.
Yeah, totally. Even if you can do things like time to first value, like we're all concerned about value, and there's plenty of values along the way, but is there one little piece of value that you can at least measure time on, like something to give yourself something to latch onto? Even like focusing on unhealthy customers, people that have churned, people that have not activated, people that haven't used specific features, and then going back to your onboarding process if you have one and saying, did we talk about those things? If not, it's probably not a surprise that they didn't do those things. And if yes, and this is again to what you were saying earlier, like not just the reporting, but look inward more often than pointing fingers at sales or marketing or support or not having tools or even leadership. Did we talk about that thing? If yes, and they still didn't activate, then we're talking about it wrong. Like, did we present the value incorrectly? Did we present it too soon? Did we confuse customers? Did we not really teach them what it is? Because it's always easy to point fingers back at sales and say they didn't set expectations or they missold this customer. But a lot of that is also adjustable. And also, if you're finding that true, then own that too and go share feedback with your sales teams and say, hey, I have noticed that these 10 customers that came from Cam, they all got hung up on this one thing. Or is there opportunity to talk about that one thing differently or bring it up sooner in the process? So there's a lot of need to look inward, I think, if you're trying to really build this program out. And I've done both versions of this, where I've just complained and said, I wish I had more tools and wish I had more buy-in and wish I had more support, and that didn't change anything. So I was in the same place. Or I leaned in and tried some things and tested some things and measured some things and shared those numbers over and over again and tried to tie it back to business goals and business metrics where I can. And that generally has helped or has gotten the ears of at least some folks to listen.
I think the overarching message to me is that nobody's going to come save you and you have to save yourself. Leadership is probably not going to understand onboarding, and it is your job to show them why it matters. And it's hard on top of onboarding already typically has a super busy job, but that's just the reality of the position. And it's going to be for the next 5 to 10 years, I think. One thing I would love to talk about, if we do have any executives or members of leadership that are watching, do you have any tips for how they can better support or empower their onboarding teams to take ownership of the higher level business metrics and their impact?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've always had our executives do at most places I've worked at when I've actually got to own the program or own the teams is have them join calls. Have them sit in on an onboarding call front to end with a customer. Not only will that customer feel incredibly special that your leadership is sitting there, but it is very eye-opening what actually gets talked about, how much work goes into those calls. Because I think part of the battle is, and this is to no one's fault, but if you don't know what's going on in those calls or in the day-to-day of an onboarding rep, you also don't know actually what is going on in the day-to-day of an onboarding rep. And so I've been in that middle position of trying to protect the integrity of the team and their well-being and their actual time when I have a leader telling me, why can't we do more? You're doing 25 a month per person. Why can't you do 30? There are more hours in the day. So it's also like helping them understand what actually goes into a 30-minute call. There's some prep ahead of that. There's notes after that. There's talking to customers. There's feedback that gets collected. There's all that information that gets shared. So I think the biggest thing you can do as an executive is join some of those calls, sit in on some of those meetings, actually hear from the reps and from the customers, their actual words, get some of that firsthand experience. And anytime I've done that, one of two things has happened. If the person is already bought into the concept, they are even more bought in. And then it's easier to then have conversations and follow up and say, hey, we're going to try this because of XYZ, because they have some context as to how that call went down. And then the other version of that is people that haven't been bought in have literally come back and told me or made comments of, wow, that is a lot harder than I thought it was. Or I had a design executive one time come, and it was one of the coolest moments of my life, or not my life, but of my career, maybe of my life, but of my career, and come back and tell me like, yeah, we actually need to do some design work in our product, because they thought it was so intuitive and so easy to click around, but actually watching a customer get confused and stuck and not being able to progress, and then wondering, why aren't they activating this part of our application? So there are oftentimes things like design feedback, marketing feedback, sales feedback, onboarding feedback. Again, it's not pointing directions any one way. It's looking at all of that and building a more cohesive journey. And then another thing that as a like manager of an onboarding team that you could do is really share your goals with those executives and ask, more importantly, do these goals align with where you want this business to go? Or are we heading in the right direction together? Because I also don't want to just be setting arbitrary goals for my team or metrics or KPIs that aren't impacting the business, because then you're risking this team being dissolved or not having the resources it needs. Plus, when that team, at least in my experience, when that team senses that they are impacting the business, I think they get more excited about their job. They get more excited to talk to customers. Like that emotion really presents itself to customers and internally, and that energy I think is exciting. And I've had this comment from other, especially when I used to work in office in pods and everyone's there. I've had other sales leaders and other CS leaders come and tell me, we love the energy from your teams and from that section of the office. And it's fun hearing them talk to customers and have a good time in those initial moments. And again, that's some of that qualitative stuff. But I do believe that initial impression that's left and that experience that customer gets does matter, in addition to obviously activating and using the features and products and service. But that coupled with that powerful experience up front and that streamlined handoff and feeling special even beyond sales and marketing, I think does have an impact on long-term retention and customer satisfaction.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I would also say if you are a leader, invite your onboarding leaders to your executive meetings. I think a lot of times it's sales, marketing, product, and onboarding, and that's the whole, I think it's a persona thing. I really do think that's a huge part. That's a problem, is onboarding has a really hard time advocating for themselves generally, the type of people who are in onboarding or customer success generally. And so as a leader, these people are not going to be like your VP of revenue and your VP of sales who are going to be asking for a seat at the table all the time. You have to empower these people and let them know that you care about their role and you care about their impact and you actually want to hear about it. You have to empower this department, all departments, but this department specifically. You can't wait for them to ask for a seat at the table, and you have to invite them and give them the space and then actually listen to them when they're speaking and give them a real opportunity to speak rather than just like having them sit on the sidelines.
Yeah, that is such a good one. I've had to fight for my way to that table from time to time.
Yep.
I'll share this story because I think it's very related to what you're saying. But even like I was traveling to another office for a leader meeting one time, and I was a leader on an onboarding function. And we had our so I was like, cool, I've made it. I've been invited to at least be in the discussion and in the conference rooms. And we did all that. And then unbeknownst to me, there was another invite that had gone out to those leaders to go out to dinner that night. And everyone but me went to that dinner, to the point where like my own counterparts were like, Cheryl, you coming? And I was confused as to coming where. And then we both connected the dots, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm not invited to that thing, which candidly hurt. And I put on a face and was like, yeah, it's not a big deal. I was going to go eat something else anyway. And then I left and was like, that sucks. Like, I'm still not even, and it sounds silly, and dumb, but it's things like not being even included on that email alias. And it wasn't intentional. I just wasn't on the csleaders at whatever.com. And it's things like that where it took a while. At this specific job, it took me about a year to get to that point of, all right, now I'm actually, and once it worked, then I was presenting monthly to the CRO and the CMO and all of their VPs across all functions. So like it did get buy-in, but man, clawing my way up to get a seat at that table. And part of how I did that is I remember leading into like business reviews internally, I'd be asked to put together data on the onboarding program. I wasn't invited into those QBRs initially. And leading up to them, I'm getting asked questions about the data. Literally during them, I'm getting Slack messages about the data and asking questions about the data. And after that, I'm getting post work about the data. We need to change this, or we need to think about it this way. And then I have no context to how those questions went down or what the conversation looked and felt like. And I had, before this job, I had worked at one where I was on the senior leadership team and was included in all those meetings. So my kind of passive aggressive feedback was, I don't even actually, like I've sat in these meetings. I know there's nothing that special happening in these closed doors. But what's actually a waste of my time and your time is that I could have just been in there and answered this in real time and we would have moved on from this. Or I could have had a better sense of what senior leadership is looking for. And now we're playing this back and forth game and you're just messaging me and it is causing so much work for both of us. Why don't you just invite me to this meeting and I can present for 5 minutes? And it took 2 rounds of that. And then I finally got invited to the next QBR. And I was like, yes, we're making some progress here. But that was like a tangible way where I found an opportunity. And again, this kind of ties to what you were saying. I found an opportunity to weasel my way into the business metrics and into the business goals. And you guys are already talking about this at a high level and you think this program impacts that. Let me just hear that so I can quickly turn around and go put together the type of reporting you want, the type of data you want. But I love that you said that because that's such a pain and it's demotivating and it's such an easy thing that at least from our lens, it feels like an easy thing that an executive can do.
Yeah.
And if it's not valuable, fine, talk about that, but at least give that person a chance.
Totally. Yeah, I had an almost identical experience to you, to the story that you just shared. So it must be a thing that happens often to teams. But yeah, I had to claw my way into those meetings. And what was really frustrating for me was that people were constantly talking about onboarding. Onboarding was on everyone's mouth. Everyone's talking about it all the time. I was the onboarding leader and I was never invited to those conversations. And then it would get back to me.
Yeah.
About, we talked all about this for an hour. I'm going to summarize it to you in 2 sentences. Can you go do that? Okay. I have no context. I have absolutely no idea what you guys are talking about. What's the business goal? What are the new features that are going to be coming out? Because I need to build that into my process. I need to know, not only do I need to be able to have a seat so I can voice the impact that onboarding is having, but also I need to know everything that's happening. If we are changing our positioning in marketing, if we are changing our sales process, if we're changing the product, all of that directly impacts my job, which directly impacts our customers. I have to know that, and I can't find out about that afterward in a summary when there's no reason for me to not be there. There's absolutely no reason to not have your onboarding leaders in your calls. And if anything, it's such a value add to have them there.
Yeah. And when it's been like the opposite of that is when I have been able to get that buy-in, not just me as a person, but then my teams and the people supporting my teams feel so empowered when you're literally listening to your company's investor call and they're talking about how onboarding is impacting the business and the bottom line. And because of customers going through onboarding, like XYZ is true. And so even though you and I have both shared stories where it has been challenging and it's been an uphill battle, and quite frankly, I've also quit a job because I didn't get that level of buy-in. And it wasn't from it was more from the standpoint of you hired me to do something and you're inhibiting me from actually doing that thing by not including me in these conversations or in these. And it's not like from a place of anger or frustration. It's just I can't do my job. So then you need to do something else or find somebody else, because at some point I'm going to be held accountable for metrics, rightfully so. I do agree I should be held accountable. But if I can't have any input or any say or any conversation or even any foresight into it, to your point, how can you expect me to then go convey that to customers and convey that to my team and so on? But yeah, you said something that resonated really well, which was like, make it about the customer. So if I don't know this, the customer is going to suffer because of this. If I don't know that this update's coming, the customer is not going to be able to do that. If I know our sales targets are changing, or if I don't know our sales forecast or targets are changing, and now all of a sudden there's an influx of onboardings that we can't get to, that's a negative customer experience because we can't help all those customers out. So wherever possible, make it about the customer and then make it about revenue and do that in tandem. And hopefully you get through to somebody and you can make some breakthroughs and start to convey that value. And you have to do it ongoing. It's not a one and done thing. It's not we did good one quarter and all of a sudden I'm a director of onboarding and I get all the budget in the world. Absolutely not. It doesn't work that way. You have to stick with it. You got to be consistent. You have to keep trying and changing and evolving. And we say onboarding never ends for that reason. It's not just the act of the onboarding with a customer. It's all those things around it. It's what is working, what's not working. It's tweaking the programs. It's making tiny little changes. And that doesn't mean we say this to our customers at Arrows. That doesn't mean sit and overhaul your entire template and process every month and spend hours upon hours doing it. That is literally, we tried one thing, it worked to this degree. Great, let's keep doing that. We also asked customers to do this 10 task and 9 of them didn't do it. What's wrong with that task? What can I do differently? Start with what can I do differently? And if you do that, and then go share feedback with your sales or marketing or product team, as long as you can convey that you did something and then ask for help or then ask for them to change something, again, you're increasing your chances of getting some buy-in and some collaboration, because those are going to be your champions to those leadership meetings, to those QBRs that you might not get invited to. At least if you have other people that can vouch for you or say your name or say your program's name enough times, that might also then trigger something in a future person's head to say, you know what? Kim's name comes up every time we have these things. Where is Kim? Why isn't she sitting at this table?
You would think.
You would think. Again, try, not advising to quit your job without anything else lined up. Sometimes you got to get extreme. And no, joking aside, though, I think it's cool to see, it is selfishly cool to see directors of onboarding and onboarding being prioritized at places. The fact that you and I work at a company that is building onboarding software is a testament in and of itself. Yeah.
Cool. This was great. This was a lot. One thing that came up much earlier that fits into this conversation that I think we could talk about next is leadership, product, believing that onboarding can be solved by product entirely, and believing that basically onboarding is just like an onboarding team or an onboarding process is just like a stopgap until the product gets so intuitive that you don't need an onboarding team and you don't need a person to guide customers. So we won't talk about it yet, but I think that is a topic that we probably both have a lot to say about that probably most onboarding teams come across too.
That's a great one. That's a great one to get into next time.